Location and Geography. Chapter 1. Close your eyes and let's take a journey to a place where mountains touch clouds and a great river winds through ancient lands. A place where history runs as deep as the valleys and time moves slowly, like water over stone. Imagine, if you will, a country nestled in the heart of Southeast Asia. Not on any coast, but cradled inland, surrounded on all sides by neighbors. This is Laos, a landlocked nation resting peacefully on the Indo-Chinese peninsula, like a quiet secret waiting to be discovered. Picture the map of this region in your mind's eye. To the northwest, Laos shares its borders with Myanmar and China, ancient neighbors with their own rich stories. To the east lies Vietnam, its boundary tracing mountain ridges and forest paths. Southeast, Cambodia extends a gentle border, and to the west, Thailand, once called Siam, curves along Laos's longest frontier. This nation, covering approximately 236,800 square kilometers, is slightly larger than the American state of Minnesota. But unlike Minnesota's prairies and lakes, Laos is a land that reaches upward. 3/4 of the country is made up of mountains and plateaus, endless ranges of green peaks that fold into one another like waves frozen in time. Only a quarter consists of plains, and these fertile lowlands spread mostly along the banks of one very special river, the Mekong. Let that name settle in your thoughts. The Mekong River, one of the great rivers of our world. It runs along much of Laos's western border, carving its patient path through the landscape. For centuries, millennia even, this river has been life itself to the people here. Transportation, agriculture, fishing, trade, settlements, all blooming along its muddy banks. Even now, in your mind, you might hear the gentle lapping of its waters, the distant call of a boat's horn, the rustle of bamboo forests along its shores. Now, let's drift back through the mists of time, back before modern borders, before nations as we know them today. Back to the year 1353, when recorded Laotian history truly begins. In that distant time, a man named Phan Gum, a name worth remembering, though you need not hold it tightly, founded a kingdom. He called it Lan Xang. Lan Xang, the kingdom of the million elephants. Can you imagine? 1,000,000 elephants moving through those mountain forests, their grey forms like living boulders among the trees. It's a poetic name, perhaps not literally true, but it speaks to the grandeur and abundance of this realm. Through the 14th century, Phan Gum and his successors united most of what we now call Laos, along with parts of what is today northern and eastern Thailand. It was a time of consolidation, of bringing scattered peoples together under one vision, one banner. And with this political unity came something equally important, a spiritual foundation. The early rulers of Lan Xang established Theravada Buddhism as the state religion. This wasn't merely a political decision. It was a cultural transformation that would shape Lao identity for centuries to come. Theravada Buddhism, with its emphasis on personal enlightenment, its saffron-robed monks, its golden stupas gleaming in the tropical sun, became woven into the very fabric of what it meant to be Lao. Temples rose in villages and cities. Rituals marked the seasons. The teachings of the Buddha became the moral compass of daily life. For centuries, Lan Xang endured, this kingdom of the million elephants, maintaining its independence and identity. But kingdoms, like rivers, changed their courses. Internal conflicts arose, disagreements over succession, power struggles between noble families, the natural fractures that appear in any large realm over time. By the early 18th century, Lansang had split. Where once there was one kingdom, now there were three rival states: Luang Prabang in the north, Vientiane in the center, and Champasak in the south. Each claimed legitimacy, each held its own territory, and the unified state of Lansang was no more. The great Elephant Kingdom had divided, and with that division came vulnerability. These three Lao kingdoms, weakened by their separation, gradually fell under the influence and control of their powerful neighbor to the west, Siam, the kingdom we now know as Thailand. Siamese power extended over the divided Lao states, and for a time, they existed in that shadow. But history had more changes in store. As the 19th century progressed, another power arrived from far across the seas. France, expanding its colonial reach into Southeast Asia, established what it called French Indochina. And Laos, those three kingdoms and the mountains between them, became part of this French colonial territory. This European interlude would last until the mid-20th century, eventually leading to Laos's emergence as the independent modern nation we know today. So rest now with these images in your mind. The Mekong River flowing endlessly, mountains rising into mist, ancient kingdoms rising and falling like the breath in your chest, a land that has been shaped by geography and history, by rivers and religions, by unity and division. A landlocked country in the heart of Southeast Asia, holding stories as numerous as its legendary million elephants. Let these thoughts drift through your consciousness like clouds across those mountain peaks, and allow yourself to sink deeper into rest, knowing that the world is vast and history is long, and there is so much beauty in simply knowing these things exist. Breathe deeply, relax, and let the story of Laos carry you gently towards sleep. Early Human Presence, Chapter 2. Let your mind drift now, far back in time, further than kingdoms, further than empires, further even than the first whispered legends. We're going back tens of thousands of years to a time when the world was younger, wilder, and the story of humanity in Laos was just beginning to be written in stone and bone. In the northern mountains of Laos, there is a cave. Its name is Tam Pa Ling, and it holds secrets that have waited in darkness for millennia. When researchers entered this cave and began their careful excavations, brushing away sediment grain by grain, they discovered something extraordinary. Fossil remains, human remains, not recent, not ancient by our usual measure, but truly, profoundly old. These bones tell us that anatomically modern humans, people like us, Homo sapiens, were present in this region at least 70,000 years ago. Some evidence suggests they may have been there even earlier, perhaps between 86,000 and 68,000 years ago. Imagine that span of time. 70,000 years, 86,000 years. Numbers so large they become almost abstract, like counting stars. Among the recent discoveries at Tam Pa Ling are a cranial fragment, a piece of someone's skull, and a tibial bone, part of a leg that once carried a person through these mountain forests. These fragments have been directly dated to roughly 68,000 to 86,000 years ago, making them some of the earliest known Homo sapiens fossils in all of mainland Southeast Asia. Think of that. These bones, resting in the cool darkness of a limestone cave, are witnesses to our species' earliest chapters in this part of the world. But these weren't the first finds from Tam Pa Ling. Earlier excavations had already recovered a partial skull, labelled TPL1 by researchers, and two mandibles, jawbones, designated TPL2 and TPL3. Together, these represent at least three different individuals, three separate people who lived and died roughly between 70,000 and 46,000 years ago. Three people whose faces we'll never know, whose names are lost to eternity, but whose presence we can still detect, like echoes in a canyon. The scientists working at this site have done something remarkable. They've analyzed the cave sediments in extraordinary detail, building what they call an age model, a timeline written in layers of earth. Their work indicates that human-related fossils accumulated in Tam Pa Ling over approximately 56,000 years. The overall sediment sequence in the cave spans roughly 86,000 years. Imagine the patience required to understand this. Imagine the cave itself, silently accumulating its layers, millennium after millennium, like pages in an unimaginably slow book. Why were these ancient people here? Researchers believe that Tam Pa Ling may lie along a migration corridor, a route that Homo sapiens followed when they were dispersing out of Africa, spreading through mainland Southeast Asia, continuing onward to East Asia, and ultimately reaching Australasia. Picture them, if you can. Small groups moving through landscapes that were sometimes familiar, sometimes utterly strange, following rivers, crossing mountains, always searching for food, for shelter, for the next safe place to rest. And sometimes they rested in caves like Tam Pa Ling. Our journey through deep time takes us to another location now. Not far from Tam Pa Ling, there's a place called Tam Hang, a rock shelter in northern Laos. Archaeological work here has uncovered a treasure trove of evidence from a much later period, though still incredibly ancient by most standards. More than 9,000 stone artifacts have been found at Tam Hang, along with countless animal bones. These remains are linked to something called the Hobinian Techno-Complex, a tradition of hunter-gatherer stone tool making that spread across Southeast Asia. Radiocarbon dating, the careful scientific process of measuring the decay of carbon isotopes in organic material, places Tam Hang's main Hobinian occupation between about 18,000 and 10,000 years before the present. This makes it one of the earliest well-dated cultural sites in Laos, a window into how people lived in this region at the end of the last ice age. What happened at Tam Hang? The evidence speaks clearly. Burnt mammal bones have been found alongside the stone tools, telling us that prehistoric groups used this shelter as a butchering and food processing site. You can almost see it, can't you? A small group gathered around a fire, the flickering light casting shadows on the rock walls. They've brought back a kill from the day's hunt. They work together, using their carefully crafted stone tools to process the meat, the bones crackling in the flames. There's conversation, perhaps, though we'll never know what language they spoke. And there's the fundamental human activity of transforming raw nature into sustenance. These Hobbinian stone tool assemblages have a distinctive character. They're characterized by flaked cobble tools, sometimes called sumatroliths by archaeologists. These aren't random rocks. They're purposefully shaped implements, the result of skill and tradition passed down through generations. And they're not unique to Tam Hung. Similar tools have been identified at multiple sites across Laos, linking the region's early foragers to a broader Southeast Asian hunter-gatherer tradition. This tells us something important. Even tens of thousands of years ago, people in different areas were connected, sharing techniques, perhaps trading. Definitely part of a larger cultural network. The work continues today. At Tam Pa Ling and other sites, excavations and sophisticated microstratigraphic studies, the analysis of sediment layers at microscopic scales, continue to refine our understanding. Each season, each careful excavation, reveals a little more. The timeline of early human activity in Laos becomes clearer, more detailed. What we know now is that humans repeatedly used Tam Pa Ling Cave and its surroundings, returning again and again across tens of thousands of years, long before anyone thought to record events in writing, before clay tablets or paper, or any permanent record existed. These were people who left no written words, but they left something perhaps more enduring. Their physical presence, written in the language of bone and stone, waiting patiently in the earth for us to learn how to read it. So rest now, and let your mind hold this vast expanse of human time. From 86,000 years ago to 10,000 years ago and beyond, people have walked in Laos. They've sought shelter in its caves, hunted in its forests, made tools by firelight, told stories we'll never hear. They are our ancestors, in the broadest sense, fellow humans who navigated this world with the same basic hopes and needs we carry today. Breathe slowly. Let these ancient echoes wash over you. And as you drift towards sleep, know that human history is so much deeper and richer than we often imagine, stretching back into a past that is both unfathomably distant and intimately connected to who we are today. Early Societies and Daily Life, Chapter 3. Now let us move forward through time, from those distant caves and ancient stone tools, and settle into a rhythm more recent, yet still steeped in tradition. Let us enter a Lao village, as it has existed for centuries, where life follows the patient turning of the seasons and the eternal cycle of rice. In the lowland areas of Laos, among the people known as Lao Lum, daily life has traditionally revolved around one essential practice: wet rice agriculture. Picture vast green paddies stretching across the plains, mirror-like pools of water reflecting the sky. The entire year is structured around this precious crop, planting, transplanting, and harvesting. It is not simply farming. It is the heartbeat of existence, the rhythm that all other activities move around. And the rice they grow is special. Glutinous rice, sticky rice, the kind that clings together when steamed. This is the staple food, prepared not by boiling but by gentle steaming, which preserves its distinctive texture. Imagine now a family gathered for their meal. They sit on the floor together, as families have done for generations. The sticky rice is served in baskets woven from bamboo, and around these baskets are placed common bowls, soups, vegetables, meat when available. There are no individual plates, no forks. People eat with their fingers, rolling the rice into small balls, dipping it into the shared dishes. It is intimate, communal, a daily ritual of togetherness. The houses in these villages are wonderfully simple and perfectly adapted to the climate. Built on stilts from wood and bamboo, they rise above the ground, protection from flooding during the monsoon rains, and allowing cooling air to circulate beneath. Inside, the furnishings are minimal. Mats or thin mattresses spread on the floor for sleeping. A low bamboo table where the family eats. A few metal pots and dishes for cooking. Nothing excessive, nothing wasted. Everything serves its purpose. Step outside any traditional household, and you'll find small vegetable gardens and fruit trees growing nearby, often near a water source where they can be easily tended. Here grow the minor crops that round out daily life. Cotton for clothing, tobacco for the pipes some elders enjoy, sugarcane for its sweet juice. These are grown mainly for household use rather than for sale. Self-sufficiency is valued, independence cherished. Listen carefully, and you'll hear the sounds of village animals, chickens scratching in the dirt, ducks waddling toward water, pigs rooting in their pens, and most important of all, the water buffalo, those massive, patient creatures with their curved horns and knowing eyes. Most families keep at least 1 or 2 buffalo for ploughing the rice fields. These animals are treasured, essential for work, and saved for meat only on special occasions, rituals, communal celebrations, moments when the whole village comes together. But rice farming alone has never been enough. The land offers more if you know where to look. Hunting and fishing have long supplemented what the fields provide. Men venture into the forest with bows or spears, or wait patiently by rivers with nets and hooks. Women wade into shallow waters with baskets, expertly scooping up small fish. The forest itself is a larder of wild treasures. Bamboo shoots pushing up through the earth, mushrooms appearing after rain, wild fruits hanging from branches, roots that could be dug and eaten, plants that heal and soothe when illness comes. Gathering these forest products requires deep knowledge, passed from parent to child, from elder to youth. In these villages, no one survives alone. Labor exchange and mutual aid form the very foundation of community life. When a family needs to build a house, neighbors appear, not because they're paid, but because this is how things are done, how they've always been done. Everyone works together, raising the wooden frame, weaving bamboo walls, securing the thatch roof. And when the work is finished, the host household provides a feast, a communal meal that might include a slaughtered pig or cow, rice liquor flowing freely, gratitude expressed through abundance. Another family needs help in the fields during planting or harvest. The same spirit prevails. You help me, I help you. We all help each other. This is the unspoken contract that binds the village together. For boys and young men, education traditionally came from an unexpected source. The Buddhist monastery, the Wat that stood at the heart of most communities. Here, under the guidance of saffron-robed monks, boys received their first formal schooling. They learned to read and write, studied Buddhist teachings, absorbed the moral framework that would guide their lives. But the monastery served broader purposes too. It was a community center where villagers gathered for meetings, for festivals, for making decisions that affected everyone. The Wat was both spiritual anchor and social hub, sacred and practical all at once. Life in these villages has always required a division of labor, and gender plays a role in this, though perhaps more flexibly than outsiders might assume. Women generally handle the cooking, carrying water from wells or rivers, tending to small livestock like chickens and ducks, and managing much of the petty trade, selling vegetables at markets, bartering for household needs. Men do the heavy work of ploughing, clearing new fields when needed, caring for the large animals like buffalo, and representing their households in formal village affairs. But when planting and harvesting come, those crucial moments when timing is everything, both men and women work side by side in the paddies, because some tasks are simply too important for division. In most traditional villages, social stratification has historically been limited. Look around and you see mostly small rice farmers, people of roughly equal standing. Status comes not from wealth, for there is little of it, but from other qualities. Age brings respect. The elders carry wisdom accumulated over decades. Religious knowledge matters. Those who understand the Buddhist teachings deeply are valued. Skill in any form, craftsmanship, healing, storytelling, earns admiration. This is the village level, the foundation of Laos society. But zoom out, and you see that broader kingdoms like the old Lanzang featured more complex hierarchies. At the top sat royalty, then nobles with their privileges and responsibilities, then the monks with their spiritual authority, then the great mass of commoners. And that last category included most people, the peasant farming communities that fed the kingdom, that gave it life through their labor in those endless green rice fields. So rest now with these images. A village on stilts beside a river, rice fields stretching to tree-covered hills, a family eating sticky rice with their fingers, sitting together on a woven mat, water buffalo standing knee-deep in a paddy, patient as the earth itself, neighbors working together under a tropical sun, knowing they'll eat well tonight, boys studying in the cool shade of a monastery, women laughing as they wade through water, baskets on their backs, men clearing a field at forest's edge. This is how life has been lived in Laos for centuries. Simple but not easy. Communal but with individual dignity. Structured by tradition but with room for flexibility. Connected to the land, to the seasons, to each other in ways both practical and profound. Breathe deeply. Let the peaceful rhythm of village life wash over you. And as you drift towards sleep, imagine yourself there, part of that ancient pattern, that dance between earth and water, work and rest, individual and community. First Organized States, Chapter 4. Let us return now to that moment we touched upon earlier, but this time, let us settle into it more fully. Let us watch as scattered pieces come together to form something greater. We stand at the threshold of the mid-14th century, and a prince named Fa Ngum is about to change the course of history. Before this moment, the Lao people lived in scattered principalities, small kingdoms, chiefdoms, each with its own ruler, its own territory, its own story. They shared language, culture, customs, but they were not united. They were fragments, pieces of a puzzle not yet assembled. And then came Fa Ngum, a prince with ambition and vision, who looked at these scattered pieces and saw the possibility of something whole. The kingdom he founded is called Lanzang, and is often described as the first official Lao kingdom, the main political ancestor of the modern Lao state. This is where the story of Laos as a unified political entity truly begins. This is the foundation upon which everything else would be built. Phang established his capital at a place called Muang Sua, though it would later become known by a name that carries weight even today: Luang Prabang. From this capital, nestled in the mountains of northern Laos, he conquered surrounding territories, bringing together not only much of what is now northern Laos, but also parts of what we know today as northeastern Thailand. Imagine the effort this required, the diplomacy, the warfare, the careful balance of force and persuasion needed to convince independent rulers to accept his authority. The full name of his kingdom tells you everything you need to know about his character and aspirations. Lan Zhang, Hom Kao, Land of a Million Elephants and the White Parasol. Each element of this name is symbolic, rich with meaning. The million elephants represent military strength, the power of war elephants that could crush enemy formations, inspire terror, and symbolize the kingdom's might. The white parasol is the ancient symbol of royal authority in Southeast Asia, a sacred object held over the king, marking him as chosen, legitimate, divinely sanctioned. Together, these symbols spoke of a kingdom both powerful and rightfully ruled. Phang did not build his kingdom alone, starting from nothing. He had help, and it came from an unexpected source: the Khmer Empire, that great civilization centered at Angkor, which was by this time beginning its long decline. The Khmer saw strategic value in a strong Lao kingdom to their north. It could serve as a buffer state, a shield against other powers. They provided Phang with an army, the military force he needed to secure and expand his rule. Without this support, Lan Xang might never have been born. Once established, Lan Xang endured. From the 14th century through the 17th, it controlled most of present-day Laos, and at times its influence extended over neighboring regions. For its era, it was one of the larger mainland Southeast Asian kingdoms. Not the largest, perhaps, but substantial, respected. A power that had to be reckoned with. What held this kingdom together? Military might alone is never enough. Lan Xang found its binding force in religion. Theravada Buddhism became absolutely central to the state's identity. Under the protection and patronage of Lan Xang's kings, Buddhist monasteries multiplied across the realm. Legal traditions developed, rooted in Buddhist principles of dharma and righteous rule. Scholarship flourished as monks preserved texts, taught students, and served as the kingdom's intellectual class. The monasteries became threads weaving diverse local communities together, giving people from different valleys and villages a shared spiritual framework, a common language of faith and practice. But peace was never guaranteed. Lan Xang had to defend itself repeatedly against stronger neighbors who eyed its territories with hungry interest. Burma, or Myanmar as we call it today, attacked from the west. Siam, the kingdom of Ayutthaya that would become Thailand, pressed from the south and west. Jai Viet, the Vietnamese kingdom, threatened from the east. Invasions came and went, some repelled with great loss of life, others resulting in temporary submission. Yet somehow, through centuries of these struggles, Lan Xang maintained its core territories, its identity, its independence. It bent but did not break. The kingdom reached its zenith in the 17th century under a ruler named King Surinyavongsa, sometimes written as Sulinyavongsa, for spellings shift across time and translation. His reign was Lansang's golden age, a period of relative peace after so much conflict. During these decades, the kingdom enjoyed clearer legal codes that brought order and predictability to governance. Active diplomacy connected Lansang to distant courts. Foreign visitors came and marveled at what they found. Literature flourished as poets and chroniclers wrote in the Lao script. Artists created works of beauty, sculptures, paintings, temple decorations that gleamed with gold leaf. Religious life deepened as monasteries became centers not just of worship, but of learning, debate, and cultural preservation. It must have seemed, during those prosperous years, that Lansang would endure forever. But kingdoms, like all human creations, are fragile things. They depend on capable leadership, on clear succession, on the ability to manage competing interests and ambitious nobles. When King Surinyavongsa died in 1694, he left no clear heir, or perhaps too many potential heirs, each with their own claim and their own supporters. Succession disputes erupted, bitter arguments over who had the right to rule, who carried the legitimate mandate. These internal conflicts made the kingdom vulnerable, and neighboring powers were quick to interfere, backing different claimants, seeking to increase their own influence. The fractures grew, the center could not hold, and by 1707, just 13 years after Surinyavongsa's death, Lansang had split into 3 separate regional kingdoms. Luang Prabang in the north, ruling from the ancient capital, Vientiane in the center, controlling the middle Mekong Valley, Champasak in the south, holding the lower territories. Each claimed to be the true heir of Lansang, but the reality was unavoidable. The first unified Lao kingdom had ended. The 1,000,000 elephants had scattered. Yet even in its division, Lansang's legacy endured. The 3 kingdoms that emerged from its collapse all maintained the cultural and religious traditions it had established. They all considered themselves Lao. They all practiced Theravada Buddhism. They all remembered, with a mixture of pride and sorrow, the time when they had been one. So rest now with this rise and fall, this arc of a kingdom's life. See Fangum, young and ambitious, gathering the scattered principalities. See Lansang at its height under Surinyavongsa, peaceful and prosperous, its temples golden in the tropical sun. See it fracture and divide, the inevitable entropy that claims all earthly powers. Nothing lasts forever, but some things leave marks that time cannot erase. Lansang was one of those things. It created an idea, the idea of Laos as a unified nation. And ideas, once born, are harder to kill than kingdoms. Breathe slowly. Let the centuries wash over you like gentle rain. From 1353 to 1707, 3.5 centuries of history condensed into minutes, into moments, into the space between one breath and the next. Rest well, knowing that all things rise and fall, bloom and fade, yet somehow the story continues, carrying forward what matters most. Gradual changes over time. Chapter 5. Now we enter a different kind of story, not the dramatic founding of kingdoms or the sudden fall of empires, but something slower, more subtle. The way a river changes its course over decades, the way a tree grows so gradually, you don't notice until suddenly it towers above you. This is the story of transformation, measured not in moments, but in generations. Let us begin by stepping back and seeing the larger pattern. The region we now call Laos was once a landscape of fragmentation. Small Thai principalities scattered across valleys, indigenous groups in the highlands, each community largely governing itself. Then, in the 14th century, came that dramatic shift we've already explored, the rise of Lanzang, which centralized political power for the first time, drawing these scattered pieces into one unified kingdom. But unity, as we've learned, is difficult to maintain. Through the 17th and 18th centuries, Lanshang gradually weakened, not through a single catastrophic event, but through the slow erosion of succession disputes, the constant friction of regional rivalries, the accumulation of small fractures that eventually became cracks, and finally the kingdom fragmented into three smaller kingdoms: Luang Prabang, Vientiane, and Champasak. This wasn't a sudden collapse, no dramatic ending. It was more like a great tree slowly splitting under its own weight, each section continuing to live but no longer connected. These three kingdoms entered a new phase of existence in the late 18th and 19th centuries. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, they shifted from relative autonomy to dependence. The kingdom of Siam, growing stronger to the west, extended its influence eastward across the Mekong River. Garrisons were established, tribute demanded, treaties signed. The Lao kingdoms maintained their courts, their ceremonies, their local traditions, but increasingly they operated under Siamese suzerainty, a relationship where they acknowledged a superior power while retaining some internal control. Then, from across the seas, came another shift. In the late 19th century, France arrived with imperial ambitions. The French progressively replaced Siam as the dominant power in the region, a transition negotiated through treaties and backed by the implicit threat of European military might. The Lao territories became a French protectorate, then were formally incorporated into French Indochina alongside Vietnam and Cambodia. This brought profound changes, but again, they came gradually, spreading over decades. New administrative systems were introduced, replacing traditional forms of governance with colonial bureaucracy. Schools appeared, teaching in French, creating a small educated elite who could navigate both Lao and European cultures. Infrastructure slowly developed: roads, bridges, administrative buildings. The changes were uneven, concentrated mostly in towns, while rural villages continued their ancient rhythms largely undisturbed. And then came World War II, bringing chaos and confusion. Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia, displacing French colonial rule. For a brief period, control shifted yet again. But when the war ended in 1945, there followed a gradual, awkward restoration of French authority. The period that followed was complex, overlapping, almost contradictory. French administrators trying to reassert control, Japanese influences lingering, and something new emerging: Lao nationalism. The idea that the Lao people should govern themselves. From the late 1940s through 1954, this tension slowly resolved itself, though not without struggle. There was a gradual movement from colonial rule toward formal independence. Negotiations, compromises, international conferences. Finally, in 1954, the Geneva Agreements were signed, and Laos became fully independent as a constitutional monarchy. The ancient royal line of Luang Prabang would provide the king, but modern institutions, a constitution, a parliament, would share power. It seemed for a moment like a workable solution. But the world had other plans for Laos. Between the 1950s and 1975, the country transformed from a fragile constitutional monarchy into a Cold War battleground. The conflict was gradual at first, then increasingly violent. A civil war developed between royalist forces, neutralists, and communist Pathet Lao rebels. The Vietnam War spilled across borders. The United States, seeking to disrupt communist supply lines, conducted massive, prolonged bombing campaigns. More ordnance dropped on this small, landlocked country than on all of Europe during World War II. Slowly, relentlessly, these bombings undermined royal authority and devastated rural life. Villages were destroyed, populations displaced, the ancient agricultural rhythms shattered. In 1975, the long conflict reached its conclusion. Political power shifted decisively when the communist Pathet Lao seized control and declared the Lao People's Democratic Republic. The monarchy was abolished. The king abdicated, then was quietly imprisoned and later died in a remote camp. A new era had begun. But even this revolutionary change brought gradual transformation rather than instant upheaval. The new government initially imposed strict socialist policies, collective farming, state control of the economy, restrictions on private enterprise and movement. But reality proved stubborn. Food shortages appeared. People fled across the Mekong to Thailand, creating refugee outflows that emptied villages and embarrassed the government. Incrementally, pragmatically, the authorities adjusted their approach, loosening the most restrictive policies. Then, in 1986, came a more formal shift. Laos introduced market-oriented reforms, a policy often compared to Vietnam's Doi Moi program. This marked a slow but steady transition from a centrally planned economy towards something more mixed, more flexible, more influenced by market forces, though always within the framework of continued one-party communist rule. Control remained centralized politically, but economically, doors began to open. Since the 1990s, the pace of change has accelerated, though still in that gradual Lao manner. The country has integrated step by step into the regional and global economy. It joined ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, becoming part of a larger regional community. Foreign investment was welcomed, particularly from neighboring Thailand and China. Cross-border infrastructure developed, most famously the Friendship Bridge spanning the Mekong, linking Laos physically to Thailand and symbolically to the wider world. Slowly, the country has urbanized. Young people move from villages to cities seeking opportunity. Traditional subsistence farming gives way to cash crops and wage labor. Modern buildings rise in Vientiane. Tourists arrive, bringing foreign currency and foreign ideas. Cell phones appear in even remote areas. The internet connects Lao youth to global culture. Yet through all these changes, and they are profound changes, something essentially Lao persists. The temples still stand, Saffron-robed monks still walk morning alms rounds. Sticky rice is still the staple food. Festivals still mark the turning of seasons. The Lao language survives and adapts. The Mekong still flows, patient and eternal, as it has through all these centuries of transformation. What we see, looking back across these centuries, is not a simple story of progress or decline, not a tale of sudden revolutions, but rather the complex reality of gradual change, how societies adapt, how they absorb outside influences while trying to preserve what makes them themselves, how they navigate between tradition and modernity, autonomy and dependence, the old ways and the new. Breathe deeply now. Let these waves of change wash over you. Kingdoms rising and falling, colonial powers coming and going, wars fought and ended, economic systems tried and modified. Through it all, people continue living, adapting, enduring, finding ways to maintain dignity and community despite circumstances often beyond their control. Rest in this knowledge. Change is constant, but it is rarely as sudden or complete as we imagine. Most transformation happens gradually, like the erosion of mountains, like the patient work of water on stone. And somehow, through all these changes, essential things persist. Language, culture, identity, the knowledge of who we are and where we came from. Outside influence and foreign rule. Chapter 6. Let us now look at Laos from a different angle, not from within, but from without. Not as the story of what the Lao people chose for themselves, but as a story of powers arriving from beyond their borders, each leaving its mark, each shaping the nation's trajectory in ways both subtle and profound. The first major imperial shadow to fall across this land came from the south. The Khmer Empire, centered at the magnificent temple complex of Angkor, exerted cultural and political influence over parts of the Middle Mekong Valley long before the rise of Lan Xang in the 14th century. You can still see traces of this influence in certain architectural styles, in religious practices, in the way power was conceived and displayed. The Khmer were not the last outside power to shape Lao history. They were merely the first. When Lan Xang emerged as a unified kingdom, it inherited a difficult geography, surrounded by powerful neighbors, each with their own ambitions. The kingdom had to constantly manage external pressure. To the south and the west lay Ayutthaya, the Siamese kingdom, what we now call Thailand. To the northwest was Lanna, another Thai kingdom centered in what is now northern Thailand. Further west loomed Burma, or Myanmar, a military powerhouse. And to the east pressed Jai Viet, the Vietnamese kingdom with its own imperial aspirations. Lan Xang existed in the middle of all these forces, fighting wars when necessary, negotiating alliances when possible, always working to preserve its autonomy in a dangerous neighborhood. The Burmese proved particularly aggressive in the 16th century. Their forces repeatedly invaded, sweeping across the region, at times turning neighboring Thai kingdoms into Burmese vassals. Lan Xang itself came under attack, facing existential threats, but under a capable king named Setha Thirath, the kingdom succeeded in repelling major Burmese campaigns. These victories are still remembered with pride, moments when the Lao people stood their ground against overwhelming force and survived. Yet survival against one threat often meant vulnerability to another. By the late 18th century, Siam had become the dominant external power. After Lanzang split into three kingdoms, Vientiane, Luang Prabang, and Champasak, each found itself drawn into Siam's orbit, brought under varying degrees of vassalage and tribute. They remained kingdoms in name, with their own courts and ceremonies, but their foreign policy, their major decisions, increasingly required Siamese approval. This arrangement held until 1828, when it shattered dramatically. King Chao Anuvong of Vientiane, perhaps believing the time was right, perhaps driven by desperation or miscalculation, led a rebellion against Siamese dominance. It failed catastrophically. Siamese forces responded with overwhelming violence, destroying Vientiane so thoroughly that the city was reduced to ruins. But the destruction didn't stop there. Many Lao people were deported across the Mekong River, forcibly resettled in what is now northeastern Thailand. This mass deportation deepened Siamese control and shifted large Lao populations westward, which is why, to this day, more ethnic Lao people live in Thailand than in Laos itself. The scars of 1828 run deep. Then, from across the oceans, came another power. France, pursuing its colonial ambitions in Southeast Asia, turned its attention to the Mekong Valley. Through a combination of diplomacy and pressure, unequal treaties with Siam and with local Lao rulers, France created what it called the French Protectorate of Laos in the late 19th century. This territory later became part of the larger colonial structure known as French Indochina, which also included Vietnam and Cambodia. French rule in Laos was what colonizers called indirect rule. The monarchy wasn't abolished. Local elites weren't all replaced. Instead, they were preserved but subordinated to French residents and administrators. These French officials controlled the things that mattered: foreign policy, major taxation, infrastructure projects. The Lao kings still sat on their thrones, still performed ceremonies, but real power rested elsewhere. It was a system designed to minimize resistance while maximizing control, using existing hierarchies as instruments of colonial governance. World War II brought chaos to this arrangement. Japanese forces swept through Southeast Asia, displacing French authority. In Laos, the Japanese encouraged local nationalists, finding it useful to undermine European colonial power. But when the war ended in 1945, the French attempted to reoccupy Laos, trying to restore what had been. The result was a confused period of competing foreign influences, French colonial officials trying to reassert control, lingering effects from the Japanese wartime presence, and growing interest from Vietnam and Thailand, each with their own stakes in Laos's future. But the most intense period of foreign influence was yet to come. From the 1950s through 1975, Laos became a Cold War battleground, caught between superpowers whose conflict played out on Lao soil with devastating consequences. The United States backed the royal government and anti-communist forces, pouring in money, weapons, and advisors, conducting covert operations and massive bombing campaigns. North Vietnam and the Soviet Union supported the Pathet Lao, the communist insurgency that controlled much of the countryside. The bombing was particularly horrific. Laos became one of the most heavily bombed countries in history, more bombs dropped per capita than anywhere else on Earth. American B-52s flew secret missions, targeting supply routes, suspected enemy positions, sometimes entire villages. The campaign went on for years, day after day, night after night, until the earth itself seemed wounded. Many of those bombs didn't explode on impact. They lie buried still, unexploded ordnance that continues to kill and maim decades later. A toxic legacy that won't fade for generations. When the communists finally took power in 1975, Laos exchanged one form of foreign influence for another. The new government aligned closely with Vietnam and the Soviet bloc. Vietnamese troops and advisors were stationed in the country, helping to consolidate communist control and prevent counter-revolution. Soviet aid became central to the new regime. Economic support, technical assistance, political guidance. For over a decade, Laos existed largely within the Soviet sphere of influence, its foreign policy coordinated with Moscow and Hanoi. But the late 1980s brought change, as they did across the communist world. The Soviet Union began its slow collapse. Vietnam, struggling economically, started opening to the West, and Laos, pragmatically, began diversifying its foreign relations. Ties with Thailand strengthened, despite ideological differences. Trade proved more important than politics. China increased its influence, providing investment and infrastructure. International financial institutions like the World Bank and Asian Development Bank became involved. The period of alignment with a single bloc gave way to a more complex web of relationships. So here we stand, looking back across centuries of outside influence and foreign rule. Khmer cultural dominance, Siamese military pressure and vassalage, French colonial administration, Japanese wartime occupation, American bombs and Soviet aid, Vietnamese troops and Chinese investment. Each power arrived with its own agenda, its own vision for what Laos should be, and each left its mark, in institutions, in infrastructure, in memories both bitter and complex. Yet through all of this, and this is perhaps the most remarkable thing, Laos has survived as a distinct entity. The language persists, the culture endures. The sense of being Lao, of having a unique identity separate from Vietnamese, Thai, Cambodian, or Chinese, remains strong despite centuries of pressure to assimilate or disappear. There's a resilience in this, a kind of strength that doesn't announce itself loudly, but simply continues, bends without breaking, adapts without surrendering everything essential, like bamboo in a storm, flexible enough to survive the wind. Breathe slowly now. Let this long history of outside influence settle in your mind, not as a simple story of victimization, but as a more complex tale of negotiation, resistance, adaptation, and survival. Every small nation surrounded by larger powers faces these challenges. Some disappear entirely, absorbed by their neighbors. Others, like Laos, somehow maintain themselves through the centuries, shaped by outside forces, but never completely defined by them. Rest with this knowledge. The world is full of powers great and small, influences that flow across borders like water, like wind. But identity, culture, language, these things have their own gravity, their own persistence. They can be suppressed, distorted, influenced, but they're remarkably difficult to erase completely. Sleep now, with a long view of history stretching out before and behind you. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges, its own outside influences to navigate. But the story continues, as it has for centuries, and the Lao people remain, still speaking their language, still Buddhist, still themselves despite everything. Ordinary life under these changes. Chapter 7. Now let us step away from kings and empires, from foreign powers and political transformations, and look instead at something more fundamental, more enduring. Let us look at how ordinary people actually lived, how they woke each morning, what filled their days, what they hoped for, worried about, celebrated. Because while kingdoms rise and fall, while borders shift and rulers change, daily life has its own momentum, its own patterns that persist across centuries. In the Lanzang period, most ordinary people were peasant farmers. This shouldn't surprise us. It's been the reality for most of human history in most places. They grew glutinous rice in paddies that their ancestors had worked before them. They tended vegetable gardens. They kept animals, pigs rooting in pens, chickens scratching in the dirt. Life followed the agricultural cycle, the eternal rhythm of planting and harvesting. Wet season and dry season, much as it would in rural Laos for centuries to come. At the heart of village life stood the Wat, the Buddhist temple. Picture it, a building with a sweeping roof, golden ornaments catching sunlight, perhaps a stupa nearby containing sacred relics. This wasn't just a place of worship, though it was certainly that. The Wat served as the village school, where monks taught boys to read and write. It was where the community gathered for meetings, where decisions affecting everyone were discussed and made. It was where festivals were celebrated, where the turning of seasons was marked with ceremony and joy. Religion, education, and social life were all tightly linked, woven together in a way that's difficult to separate. Almost all Lao males were expected to spend some time as novices or monks, perhaps just a few months, perhaps years, but some period of service was the norm. This practice had profound effects. Even poor boys, children from families with nothing, gained access to basic literacy and religious learning during their time in the monastery. It created a shared cultural background across social classes. A nobleman's son and a farmer's son might live very different lives, but both had sat in the Wat, both had chanted the same prayers, both had learned to read the same sacred texts. Beyond farming, villages supported themselves through crafts and small-scale trade. Many communities specialized in particular skills passed down through families. One village might be known for its weavers, producing beautiful textiles on simple looms. Another for metalwork, tools, ornaments, ceremonial objects. Others for pottery, shaping clay into vessels for cooking and storage. Some villages produced lao lao, the rice whiskey that warmed bellies and loosened tongues at celebrations. And the forest provided tradable goods, resins used in medicine and incense, cardamom for flavoring, animal skins, ivory from elephants. These products entered long-distance trade networks, connecting remote villages to markets they'd never see, in cities they'd never visit. Lanzang had its social hierarchy, certainly. Royalty and nobles stood above commoners in status and privilege. But for most people, daily routines changed little, regardless of who sat on the distant throne. Field work still needed doing. Temple rituals still marked the passage of time. Markets still operated on their regular schedules. Family duties, caring for children and elders, maintaining the house, honoring ancestors, remained constant even when dynasties shifted or borders were redrawn on maps the villagers couldn't read. When Siamese and later French powers took control, villagers still farmed rice and gathered forest products. The basic pattern of life continued, but new burdens appeared. Taxes had to be paid, now to foreign rulers rather than local lords. Corvée labor, forced work on public projects, took men away from their fields. They built roads they might never use, forts to defend borders they didn't care about. Conscription pulled young men into armies fighting wars that had nothing to do with their villages. Porterage meant carrying supplies for external rulers' campaigns. Time spent on these obligations was time not spent on their own fields, their own families. French colonial rule brought certain changes to the countryside. Limited schooling appeared in some areas, teaching French alongside Lao. Cash crops were introduced or encouraged, coffee, perhaps, or rubber in suitable areas. New market links developed. But these changes affected towns and elites far more than they touched remote villages. Most Lao remained subsistence farmers, their lives barely intersected by French administrators who rarely ventured far from colonial outposts. The French influence was real but geographically uneven, concentrated in accessible areas, while vast stretches of countryside continued largely as before. Then came the wars. The Indochina conflict, spilling over from Vietnam, the Laotian Civil War that followed, and most destructively, the American bombing campaigns that turned the sky itself into a source of terror. For rural families, this meant hiding in forests when the planes came, moving fields away from targeted areas, sometimes fleeing entirely as refugees, abandoning homes their families had occupied for generations. Planting cycles were disrupted. How can you maintain a rice paddy when bombs might fall at any moment? Schooling stopped when teachers fled and buildings were destroyed. Temple life fractured as monks scattered. For years at a time, the ancient rhythms that had sustained communities for centuries were broken. After the communist victory in 1975, new disruptions arrived, though different in character. Collectivization attempted to reorganize village economies around socialist principles. Production quotas were imposed from above. Trade was restricted, controlled by the state. For a brief period, the family-based farming that had defined Lao life for centuries was officially replaced by collective structures. But reality proved stubborn, and policies eventually bent to accommodate it. Over time, reforms allowed most households to return to family-based farming, though now combined with small state-regulated markets. The pattern resembled earlier times, families working their own fields, selling surplus when they could. But all of this now operated within a socialist one-party state that maintained political control, even as it loosened economic restrictions. And today, walk through rural Laos and you'll see a blend of old and new, tradition and modernity existing side by side. Cities increasingly feature wage labor, tourists with cameras, modern buildings and internet cafes. But many rural areas still follow a way of life that would be recognizable to their great-grandparents. Glutinous rice farming continues, the same sticky rice steamed and eaten with fingers from woven baskets. Temple-centered rituals persist. Monks in saffron robes walking morning alms rounds, receiving offerings from villagers who gain merit through giving. Bachi ceremonies still mark important life transitions, with white strings tied around wrists, to call back wandering souls and bind good fortune. Yet layered onto these ancient patterns are modern elements introduced through the state and foreign influence. Roads now connect formerly isolated villages. Schools teach a standardized curriculum. Cell phones appear even in remote areas, connecting farmers to markets, to family members working in distant cities, to the wider world. Electricity reaches more communities each year. Motorcycles replace walking for many journeys. The remarkable thing is not that life has changed. Of course it has, but that so much has remained recognizable across centuries of political upheaval. The basic rhythm of planting and harvest, the centrality of the Buddhist temple, the importance of family and community, the taste of sticky rice, the sound of chanting at dawn. These persist not because they're protected by law or enforced by authority, but because they answer deep human needs, because they've proven their worth across countless generations. So rest now with this image of continuity within change. See the farmer in his paddy, ankle deep in water, much as his ancestors stood. See the monk receiving alms, a practice unchanged for 1,000 years. See the grandmother teaching her granddaughter to weave, passing down patterns and techniques that stretch back through time. And see too the cell phone in the farmer's pocket, the motorcycle parked beside the temple, the child walking to a government school, old and new, traditional and modern, all woven together in the daily fabric of ordinary life. Breathe deeply. Let the long continuity of human experience settle over you like a warm blanket. Empires come and go, but people still wake each morning, still work, still eat, still love their families, still seek meaning in ritual and community. This is the foundation that endures beneath all the political changes, all the grand historical narratives. Sleep now, knowing that ordinary life has its own momentum, its own wisdom, its own strength. Tomorrow the sun will rise, as it always has, and people will continue the patient work of living, just as they've done for thousands of years. Transition to the modern era. Chapter 8. Now we arrive at a pivotal moment, a turning point that would reshape Laos in ways both profound and subtle. The year is 1975, and the communists have just taken power. The old order, the monarchy, the royal government, the systems that had governed for centuries, has been swept away. A new vision is being imposed, one imported from distant ideologies, one that promises equality and prosperity through central planning and collective effort. But visions, no matter how sincerely held, must eventually confront reality. After the communist victory, Laos initially followed a strict centrally planned socialist model. This was the orthodoxy of the time, the path that revolutionary governments were expected to take. Agriculture was collectivized. State enterprises controlled production and distribution. Private markets were restricted or banned. Everything was to be organized from above, planned by officials in the capital, directed according to socialist principles. The results were disappointing, then alarming, then undeniable. Economic stagnation set in during the late 1970s and early 1980s. Poverty became widespread, even desperate in some areas. People were hungry. The promised prosperity failed to materialize. The system simply wasn't working, and no amount of ideological commitment could change that basic fact. So in 1986, Facing a choice between dogma and survival, the government chose pragmatism. They launched what they called the New Economic Mechanism, Chintanakanmai in Laos. This was a fundamental shift away from collectivized agriculture and state monopolies toward a more market-oriented economy. It was an admission, never stated explicitly but clear in its implications, that the previous approach had failed. What did these reforms mean in practice? Farmers were allowed to own land and livestock again, simple things that had been prohibited or severely restricted. They could sell surplus produce in local markets, keeping the profits for themselves. The role of state enterprises was sharply reduced. Many were privatized, sold off to individuals or groups who might run them more efficiently. Others simply closed, unable to compete in even a partially free market. The government encouraged small private businesses. Street vendors appeared again. Small shops opened. And crucially, foreign investment was invited in. For a country that had spent a decade trying to isolate itself economically while depending on Soviet aid, this was a dramatic reversal. Laos began gradually integrating into regional trade, exposing its economy to global market forces with all the opportunities and risks that entailed. The results, while imperfect, were encouraging. From the late 1980s onward, Laos achieved relatively steady economic growth, often around 6% per year, an impressive figure for such a poor country. There were interruptions, certainly. The 1997 Asian financial crisis hit hard, a reminder that integration into global markets brings vulnerability as well as opportunity. And despite the growth, Laos remained one of the poorest countries in the region. Growth is one thing, catching up is another, especially when you start so far behind. In 1991, the government took another significant step, adopting a new constitution. This created a clearer legal framework for economic activity and foreign investment, the kind of predictability that businesses need to make long-term commitments. But politically, nothing fundamental changed. The Lao People's Revolutionary Party retained its monopoly on power. One-party rule continued, even as economic liberalization proceeded. The Chinese model, market economy, authoritarian politics, was being adapted to Laos circumstances. Regional integration became a major pillar of modernization. In 1997, Laos joined ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, becoming part of a regional bloc that emphasized economic cooperation and political dialogue. The following year, Laos applied to join the World Trade Organization, signaling a commitment to rules-based international trade. These were not merely symbolic gestures. They represented real constraints on policy making, real commitments to opening the economy further. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, foreign money poured in, not as charity exactly, but as investment and aid with strings attached. Neighbors were particularly important. Thailand, already economically dominant in the region, Vietnam, fellow communist state with its own reform experience, and China, the rising giant to the north with seemingly unlimited capital and appetite for resources and influence. Japan, Australia, and European donors also contributed significant funds. This money built infrastructure that had been lacking for decades. Roads connecting previously isolated regions, hydropower dams harnessing the Mekong and its tributaries, urban development in Vientiane and other cities. The government promoted an ambitious vision, leaving least developed status by around 2020. This became an official goal, a target to rally around. The strategy focused on attracting more investment, modernizing financial systems. A stock exchange opened in Vientiane in 2011, a symbol of market sophistication, even if trading volumes remain modest, and leveraging Laos's geography and resources. One particularly important element was the plan to turn Laos into the region's battery, exporting hydropower to Thailand, Vietnam, and eventually beyond. The Mekong and its tributaries offered enormous potential for electricity generation, and neighbors were willing to pay for it. But the transition to modernity wasn't only about economics and infrastructure. Something more subtle was happening culturally and socially. After years when Buddhism and traditional practices had been officially discouraged as backward superstitions incompatible with scientific socialism, the post-1980s period saw a cautious revival and re-emphasis of these traditions. Buddhism was rehabilitated. Temples that had been neglected received repairs. Monks, whose numbers had dwindled, were allowed and even encouraged to recruit new novices. Traditional rituals, the Bachi ceremonies that bind souls and bring blessings, the festivals marking lunar cycles and agricultural seasons, were no longer dismissed but actively promoted as part of national identity. This wasn't purely a return to tradition, it was something more complex. Buddhism and traditional culture were being used strategically, deployed to support national identity alongside modernization. As urbanization accelerated, as tourism brought foreigners with cameras and curiosity, as media exposure increased through television and later the internet, the government recognized that preserving some distinctly Lao cultural identity was important. Otherwise, what was the point of national independence? Why not simply become culturally Thai or Chinese? So in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, Laos navigated a delicate balance, opening economically while maintaining political control, modernizing infrastructure and cities while promoting traditional culture in villages and temples, welcoming foreign investment while trying to prevent complete foreign domination, integrating into regional and global systems while preserving national sovereignty and identity. It's an ongoing process, this transition to modernity. Not completed, perhaps never truly complete, because modernity itself keeps changing, keeps presenting new challenges and opportunities. But the direction is clear. Laos is no longer attempting to isolate itself or follow an ideological path, regardless of consequences. It's engaging with the world, learning, adapting, trying to find its own way forward. The country today is profoundly different from the Laos of 1975 or 1986, or even 2000. Cities are growing, filled with young people on motorcycles, their phones connecting them to global culture. Highways cross mountains that once isolated entire regions. Dams produce electricity that lights up homes that once relied on candles and firelight. Tourism brings visitors from around the world, injecting foreign currency and foreign ideas. Yet walk through a village at dawn, and you'll still see monks on their alms rounds. Visit a temple during a festival, and you'll find ancient rituals performed with care and devotion. sit with a family at mealtime, and sticky rice is still served in woven baskets, still eaten with fingers, still central to what it means to be Lao. The transition continues. Old and new exist side by side, sometimes in tension, sometimes in harmony. This is the reality of modernization in a poor, landlocked country, trying to preserve its identity while improving its people's lives, trying to honor its past while building its future. Breathe slowly now. Let this story of transformation settle in your thoughts. From crisis to reform, from isolation to integration, from poverty toward development. Though the journey is far from over, the direction is clear. Rest with the knowledge that change, even difficult change, is possible. That nations can adapt, can learn from mistakes, can chart new courses when old paths lead nowhere. That tradition and modernity need not be enemies, but can coexist, each enriching the other. What the country is known for today. Chapter 9. As we near the end of our journey through Laos, let us pause and ask, what defines this country today? When people think of Laos, those who know it, those who visited, those who've only heard whispers of its character, what comes to mind? What makes Laos distinctly itself, unlike any other place on earth? First and foremost, Laos is known for its deeply Buddhist culture. Theravada Buddhism isn't merely a religion here. It shapes moral values, organizes the calendar through festivals, inspires art and architecture, and structures daily rituals. Walk through towns like Luang Prabang at dawn, and you'll witness something timeless. Monks in saffron robes walking slowly, barefoot, carrying their alms bowls, while townspeople kneel on mats, offering sticky rice, fruit, small packets of food. This early morning almsgiving is a reciprocal act. The people gain merit through giving. The monks receive their daily sustenance. It's a transaction, yes, but one utterly suffused with spiritual meaning, with mutual respect, with the acknowledgement that material and spiritual worlds are intertwined. Laos is known for its textiles, rich weaving traditions that transform thread into stories, hand-woven silk and cotton, created on simple looms by women who learned the craft from their mothers and grandmothers. Natural dyes produce colors drawn from the forest itself, indigo blues, turmeric yellows, earthy browns and reds. The patterns aren't random decoration, they carry meaning. Symbolic motifs reflect myths passed down through generations, elements from nature, rivers, mountains, rice fields, and protective images, especially the Naga, the serpent spirits believed to dwell in water and guard sacred places. To wear traditional Lao textiles is to carry culture on your body, to display identity and heritage in every thread. The country is known for its ethnic diversity. This isn't a homogeneous nation, but a tapestry of dozens of distinct groups. The lowland Lao, who farm rice in the valleys. The Khmu, one of the oldest indigenous groups, dwelling in mountain areas. The Hmong, relatively recent arrivals from southern China, maintaining distinctive traditions in highland villages. Various Thai groups, each with their own dialects and customs. And many others, each with their own languages, their own clothing styles, their own festivals and ceremonies. This diversity contributes to a layered cultural heritage that's both challenging to govern and incredibly rich. Unity in diversity, though the unity is sometimes fragile, sometimes contested. Laos is known for Luang Prabang, that historic town nestled between rivers and mountains, recognized by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site. Walk its streets and you witness an architectural dialogue across centuries. Traditional Lao wooden houses with steep roofs designed to shed monsoon rains. Buddhist temples like Wat Cheng Tong, with their multi-tiered roofs curving toward the sky, their golden walls catching sunlight, their interiors cool and fragrant with incense, and preserved French colonial architecture, cream-colored buildings with shuttered windows, balconies, a certain European elegance adapted to tropical conditions. These different styles coexist, creating a townscape that tells its own story of cultural encounters, of influences absorbed and transformed. The country is inseparable from the Mekong River and the landscape it creates. Riverside villages where houses stand on stilts above seasonal floods. Fishing, nets cast at dawn, traps set in shallow water. The patient work of harvesting the river's bounty. River transport, boats carrying people and goods where roads are absent or impassable. Rice farming along the valleys where the Mekong and its tributaries deposit fertile soil year after year. This river defines the scenery and traditional livelihoods in ways that go beyond mere geography. The Mekong is life itself, water for crops, fish for protein, transport for trade, a spiritual presence honored in ceremony and story. Laos is known for distinctive rituals and ceremonies, none more characteristic than the bachi. Picture white cotton strings being tied around wrists, each knot accompanied by blessings and wishes for good fortune. The bachi ceremony is performed to recall and bind good spirits. The 32 souls that Lao tradition says inhabit the body, which can wander away during times of transition or stress. Bachis mark births, welcoming new life. They sanctify weddings, binding couples together. They honor departures, protecting travelers. They celebrate returns, calling back the wandering spirits of those who've been away. They welcome guests, making strangers feel honored and protected. The white strings remain on the wrist for 3 days, visible reminders of community blessing, of spiritual protection, of human connection. The country's religious architecture is distinctive and immediately recognizable. Golden stupas rise against blue skies, most famously Dat Luang in Vientiane, the national symbol appearing on currency and official emblems. Ancient temple complexes like Wat Phu, with its terrace structure ascending a hillside, combine Indic, Khmer, and Lao artistic influences, evidence of the cultural crossroads Laos has always occupied. These buildings aren't museums, but living sites where worship continues, where people come to pray, to meditate, to celebrate festivals, to simply sit in sacred space and find peace. Laos is known for traditional music and dance. The kene, a bamboo mouth organ with a haunting, almost otherworldly sound, is perhaps the most distinctive instrument. Players blow across bamboo pipes of different lengths, creating melodies that seem to capture something essential about the Lao spirit. Plaintive, resilient, connected to nature. Various regional dance forms express stories through gesture and movement. Folk operas called Lam and Lam Luang serve as vehicles for storytelling and entertainment during festivals, blending music, poetry, drama, and comedy in performances that can last hours, binding communities together through shared cultural experience. The country has a long tradition of religious and mythic literature. Lao versions of the Ramayana, called Phra Lak Phra Lam, adapt the Indian epic to local sensibilities. Jataka tales, stories of the Buddha's previous lives, are particularly important, especially the Vesantara story about the prince who gave away everything, even his children, in pursuit of perfect generosity. Local legends explain the origins of peoples and kingdoms, grounding identity in narrative, giving meaning to landscape features, connecting the present to a mythic past. And finally, perhaps most importantly for visitors and those encountering Laos from outside, the country is known for being relatively slow-paced, laid back. This reputation isn't mere stereotype. It reflects genuine cultural values. Quiet towns where life doesn't rush, where people take time for conversation, for simply sitting and watching the world. Strong village life where community matters more than individual achievement, where neighbors know each other, help each other, celebrate and mourn together. A cultural emphasis on modesty, not calling attention to yourself, not boasting, not pushing forward aggressively. Harmony with the natural environment rather than domination of it. Living within ecological limits. Taking what you need but not more. Respecting the forests and rivers as sacred spaces inhabited by spirits. This slowness, this laid-back quality, can frustrate those accustomed to efficiency and speed, but it also offers something increasingly rare in our modern world: permission to simply be without constantly doing, permission to prioritize relationships over productivity, to value contentment over ambition, to find richness in simple things, a meal shared with family, the sound of rain on a thatched roof, the sight of monks walking in morning mist. So this is what Laos is known for today: a deeply Buddhist culture, exquisite textiles, ethnic diversity, historic Luang Prabang, the Mekong landscape, Bachi ceremonies, golden stupas, the haunting sound of the Khan, mythic literature, and above all, perhaps, a different pace of life. A reminder that not everywhere must rush toward the same vision of modernity, that there are other ways to be, other values to honor. Breathe deeply now. Let these images settle. Saffron robes at dawn, white strings tied around wrists, the river flowing endlessly, golden temples catching light, the plaintive music of bamboo pipes, quiet villages where time moves like water, slow and sure. Rest with the knowledge that in this world of increasing sameness, of globalization smoothing away differences, places like Laos still exist. Imperfect, struggling with poverty and development challenges, but maintaining a distinct identity, a unique way of being in the world. Sleep now, carrying these images of Laos with you into dreams. Tomorrow, you may wake in your own place, your own time, but perhaps you remember, there is a country where monks still walk for alms, where textiles tell stories, where rivers flow through lives both ancient and modern, where being matters more than having, where community transcends individual, where the slow path is still honored. The Country Today, Chapter 10. Let us now arrive at the present moment, at Laos as it exists right now, in this very year. Not the Laos of ancient kingdoms or colonial rule, not the Laos of war and revolution, but the Laos you could visit today, the Laos that appears on contemporary maps, the Laos navigating the complexities of the 21st century. The official name is the Lao People's Democratic Republic, a mouthful that reveals its political character. This is the only landlocked country in Southeast Asia, covering about 236,800 square kilometers. We mentioned this geography at the beginning of our journey, but it bears repeating because being landlocked shapes everything: trade routes, economic opportunities, dependencies on neighbors. The capital sits at Vientiane, on the Mekong River across from Thailand, the largest city and administrative heart of the nation. The population stands at just under 8 million people. For a country this size, that's remarkably sparse, a population density around the mid-30s per square kilometre, far lower than most neighbours. Thailand, just across the river, has twice that density. Vietnam to the east is even more crowded. This low density reflects Laos's mountainous terrain, its limited arable land, and centuries of conflict and displacement that kept populations from growing rapidly. Politically, Laos remains a one-party socialist state, led by the Lao People's Revolutionary Party, the same party that took power in 1975 and has never relinquished it. Thongloun Sisoulith currently serves as both president and party general secretary, concentrating significant authority. Sonexay Sifandone holds the position of prime minister, managing day-to-day governance. These aren't names you'll hear often in international news. Laos keeps a low profile globally, preferring quiet diplomacy to headline-grabbing pronouncements. Power is exercised through party structures more than state institutions, though the distinction can be subtle. There are no opposition parties, no competitive elections in the Western sense. Stability is valued above pluralism, order above debate. Economically, Laos operates what it calls a socialist-oriented market economy, a phrase that captures the pragmatic hybrid system that emerged from the reforms of 1986. The GDP hovers around 19 to 20 billion US dollars, a figure that sounds substantial until you divide it by the population and realize how poor the country remains on a per capita basis. Yet the growth rate has been impressive. Laos has been one of the faster growing economies in Southeast Asia over the last decade, regularly posting 6 or 7% annual growth, though admittedly from a very low base. Growing fast when you start small is easier than sustaining that growth as you develop. Agriculture still employs a majority of the workforce. Walk through rural areas and you'll still see most people engaged in farming, particularly rice cultivation. This remains central to daily life, to cultural identity, to how people feed themselves and their families. But agriculture's share of GDP has been declining steadily as other sectors expand. Energy production, mining operations extracting copper and gold, construction booming in cities, and service sectors including retail, banking, and tourism. All these have grown faster than farming, shifting the economic structure even as most people still work the land. Hydropower deserves special attention because it's become a major economic pillar, perhaps the most important export sector. Laos actively markets itself as the battery of Southeast Asia, a slogan that's both aspirational and increasingly real. The Mekong and its many tributaries offer enormous potential for electricity generation. Dams have been built, sometimes controversially, with concerns about environmental damage and displacement of riverside communities, and more are planned. The electricity generated flows across borders to neighbours. Thailand is the largest customer, Vietnam takes significant amounts, and China purchases power as well. For a resource-poor country, this represents a valuable comparative advantage, though it also creates dependencies and vulnerabilities. Despite the growth statistics, despite the hydropower exports and mining revenues, Laos is still classified as a least developed or lower income country by international organizations. The improvements have been real but uneven. Significant rural poverty persists, particularly in remote highland areas where ethnic minorities live. Infrastructure remains limited. Many villages lack reliable road access, electricity, or clean water. Education outcomes lag regional averages. Literacy rates have improved, but school quality varies enormously. Health indicators show similar patterns, better than a generation ago, but still far below what most Southeast Asian countries have achieved. Maternal mortality, infant mortality, malnutrition. These challenges haven't been eliminated, only reduced. The ethnic diversity we've mentioned before continues to shape the country today. Ethnic Lao, the lowland, Buddhist, Lao-speaking majority, form the largest group, perhaps 50 to 60% of the population. But many other groups make up substantial shares. The Khmer, indigenous to the region since before the Thai migrations, live primarily in upland areas. The Hmong, concentrated in northern mountains, maintain distinct cultural practices and languages. Dozens of smaller groups, each with their own identities, their own languages, their own relationship to the land and to the state, add layers of complexity. These groups often live in remote areas where government services barely reach, where poverty is deepest, where integration into the national economy and culture remains incomplete. Managing this diversity, providing equal opportunities, preventing marginalization. These remain ongoing challenges. Internationally, Laos participates actively in regional and global organizations. It joined ASEAN in 1997, becoming part of Southeast Asia's primary diplomatic and economic bloc. It's a member of the World Trade Organization, committing to international trade rules and dispute resolution mechanisms. It participates in the East Asia Summit and various Mekong cooperation frameworks. And increasingly, it's involved in regional infrastructure and trade projects, especially those linked to China's Belt and Road Initiative. Chinese money has funded railways, highways, special economic zones. A high-speed rail line now connects Vientiane to the Chinese border, cutting through mountains that once isolated communities. This integration brings opportunities, trade, investment, connectivity, but also concerns about debt dependency, about Chinese influence becoming overwhelming, about losing autonomy in all but name. Tourism has become important and continues growing as a source of foreign exchange. Visitors come for the UNESCO World Heritage town of Luang Prabang, with its temples and French colonial charm. They come to see the Plain of Jars, those mysterious ancient stone vessels scattered across a plateau, their purpose still debated by archaeologists. They take slow boats down the Mekong, watching riverside life pass by at a leisurely pace. They visit Buddhist cultural sites, seeking authenticity, spiritual experiences, or simply beautiful photography. Tourism brings needed income, creates jobs, exposes Laos to the world, but it also brings challenges: cultural commodification, environmental stress, the risk of becoming dependent on an industry vulnerable to global shocks, as the COVID-19 pandemic dramatically demonstrated. So this is Laos today, a small, landlocked country of nearly 8 million people, a one-party state that's embraced market economics while maintaining political control, an agricultural society rapidly diversifying into energy, mining, and services, a multi-ethnic nation still working out what unity means, a country deeply engaged with its neighbors, particularly the giant to the north, China, whose influence grows yearly, a destination for tourists seeking what they perceive as authenticity in an increasingly homogenized world. It's a country at a crossroads, navigating between tradition and modernity, between autonomy and integration, between its Southeast Asian neighbors and the looming presence of China. The decisions made in the next decade about infrastructure, about debt, about environmental protection, about ethnic inclusion, about political opening or continued tight control, will shape Laos for generations to come. The challenges are real and substantial, but so are the opportunities. Laos has survived centuries of external pressure, war, and upheaval. Its people have shown remarkable resilience. The culture persists, adapts, endures. The future is uncertain, as futures always are, but the story continues, written day by millions of ordinary Laotians working, hoping, building their lives and their country. Conclusion. And so we come to the end of our journey through Laos, this small landlocked country in the heart of Southeast Asia. Let us take a moment now to remember where we've been, what we've seen, and let these memories settle gently as you prepare for sleep. We began in deep time, in caves where our earliest human ancestors left traces 70,000 years ago. Bones and stone tools, evidence of people passing through, seeking shelter, moving ever onward in humanity's long migration across the earth. We saw hunter-gatherers at Tam Hang, processing their kills by firelight, living lives we can barely imagine, yet somehow still recognize as fundamentally human. We move forward through the centuries to village life, simple houses on stilts, rice paddies stretching green to the horizon, the eternal rhythm of planting and harvest. We saw community bound together by mutual aid, by temple rituals, by the sharing of food and labor. We witnessed a way of life that persisted for centuries, adapting slowly, maintaining its essential character, even as kingdoms rose and fell around it. We watched Fangum unite scattered principalities into Lansang, the kingdom of 1,000,000 elephants, and we saw that kingdom flourish, reaching its golden age under King Surinya Vongsa, before fragmenting into 3 rival kingdoms. We witnessed the constant pressure from powerful neighbors, Burma, Siam, Vietnam, each seeking to extend their influence over these Lao territories. We followed the succession of outside powers, Siamese suzerainty, French colonialism, Japanese occupation, and finally the devastating impact of the Cold War, when Laos became one of the most heavily bombed places on Earth. We saw revolution in 1975, the difficult years that followed, and then the pragmatic reforms that opened the country to markets while maintaining political control. And we arrived at today, a Laos that is poor but growing, traditional but modernizing, maintaining its distinct identity while integrating into regional and global systems. A country where monks still walk for alms at dawn, where sticky rice is still eaten with fingers from woven baskets, where the Mekong still flows as it has for millennia. Through all these transformations across all these centuries, certain things have endured. The Lao language, adapting but surviving. Theravada Buddhism, shaping values and organizing community life. The centrality of rice, of the agricultural cycle, of the land itself. The importance of family, of community, of mutual support. The gentle pace, the emphasis on harmony, the resistance to harshness and confrontation. Laos reminds us that nations, like people, have their own character, their own way of being in the world. Not every place must rush toward the same vision of progress. Not every culture must abandon its traditions to embrace modernity. There are different paths, different speeds, different definitions of what makes life worth living. As you drift toward sleep now, carry with you these images. Golden temples catching the morning light, their roofs sweeping upward like prayers. The Mekong flowing peacefully, connecting villages, sustaining life, eternal and patient. White strings tied around wrists, binding good spirits and good fortune. The sound of the kene, that haunting bamboo instrument, its music seeming to rise from the earth itself. Rice fields, where water buffalo stand knee-deep, patient as the mountains. Let these images blend and blur, becoming dreams. Let the story of Laos, this small country with its big heart, its long history, its quiet dignity, accompany you into rest. Remember that the world is vast and varied, that human beings have found countless ways to live, to create meaning, to build communities, to honor what they hold sacred. Laos is just one example, one small country among many, but its story reminds us of the richness and diversity of human experience across time and space. Sleep now, peacefully, knowing that somewhere on the other side of the world, the sun is rising over the Mekong. Monks are walking through morning mist. Farmers are heading to their fields. Children are laughing on their way to school. Life continues, as it always has, as it always will. Simple, difficult, beautiful, and deeply, profoundly human. Rest well. Dream gently, and may you wake refreshed, carrying with you a small piece of Laos in your heart, that reminder that there are places where life moves slowly, where community matters more than individual achievement, where the old ways are honored even as the new ways arrive. Good night, sleep deeply, all is well.